Welcome, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
So as we move on to Mishpatim, which I said is a treasure trove of various halachot, it's so rich in various commandments, we are going to be going on to some commandments that involve compassion. Compassion. So interesting. V'ger lo tonu. You shall not wrong. We can translate a ger as a stranger. It also perhaps more specifically means a sojourner. The idea of sojourn, as I understand it, means someone who is not a citizen, right? Someone who is a temporary resident in a place. Rashi's going to discuss that as well. But you shall not wrong someone who essentially is a stranger in your community. Velo chatzenu, nor shall you oppress him. Ki gerim heitim be'eretz Mitzrayim, because you yourselves were strangers, right? You were gerim in the land of Egypt. So in some ways, this verse is telling us the deep spiritual significance of the whole experience of being slaves in Egypt. Or even, now here it doesn't say avadim, it says gerim. In other words, sort of non-Egyptians living amongst Egyptians. Here it goes. V'ger lo toneh. You shall not oppress, you shall not wrong a ger. What are we talking about? He says, onaat devarim. It means wronging them with words, right? Here we go. There's a French word he uses, contralier, which means abuse in French. The Yiddish looks like hennen, something like that, right? And he says, here's an example. What's he talking about by ona'at dvarim? To wrong someone with words. Essentially, it has to do with insult, to insult that person because they're not a native, right? They're not a citizen. So there's an example. He finds this word in Isaiah chapter 49. He says, Vehechalti et monecha. I will feed those who abuse you, et basaram, their own flesh. So here it's not explaining what hona'at dvarim means, but it has to do with abuse. And we're talking about here, hona'at dvarim would mean verbal abuse. You should not verbally abuse someone who is not a member of your community. Is that a relevant law? I'll let you decide. Velo, so I go on to say, Velo tilchatzenu, nor shall you oppress. Lachatz means pressure, right? You shall not oppress him. And here he's talking about b'gzeilat mamon, meaning robbing that person of money, essentially because they are not familiar with the various things. They may not know the value of something there, so you overcharge them, right? Or things like that you can do to take advantage of someone who's unfamiliar with your community and is not a member of your community and feeling somehow justified in abusing them financially or in other kinds of ways. In other words, physical. So it's saying you shouldn't abuse them neither verbally nor physically. And then the rationale, right? Ki gerim heitim, because you yourselves were gerim, you were strangers. Im hon, let's see, it looks like honito, right? If you in fact abuse him, afhu yachol lahonotcha. He can also abuse you, v'lomar lecha, and say to you, Af ata migerim bata. You yourself came from gerim, right? Mum shebecha, and there's a general principle that if you have some kind of fault, right? You have some sort of defect. Mum is a defect, right? Al ta'amar lo chavera. Don't accuse your friend of the very same defect you have. You don't do that, all right? So don't do that. Kol lashon ger. So now he goes on to this word ger. He says, Kol lashon ger, any expression that uses this term ger, Adam shelo nolad ba'uma, it's referring to a person who was not born in that Medina, that province, Elama ba b'medina acheret, but comes from a different province, lagur sham, to sojourn there. Wow. Look at this basic social decency. So again, what's the Torah about? Doing what doesn't come naturally. That's why it tells us to do these things. Onwards. Cool. So it's going on with these issues of social justice and social decency. Kol almana v'yatom lo ta'anun. So it's got to this ona'ah again, right? You shall not abuse or oppress any widow or orphan. Kol almana v'yatom lo ta'anun. You shall not oppress any widow or orphan. So the fact that it says kol, any, might imply that just because that widow might be wealthy, let's say, or well-placed, doesn't mean you can abuse them, right? Anybody who's in that state. Hu hadin lechol adam. He says this actually applies to any person, right? It's not just widows and orphans. It's talking about anybody. Do not oppress any other human being, right? And here it's not saying Yisrael, it's saying any human being. Ella, so why does this Torah say to refer to widows and orphans? Shediber hakatuv behoveh. That scripture is only expressing something that is commonplace. In other words, this is experience tells us that, and certainly in that society, and in certain Middle Eastern societies, the position of women, if they are widowed or if children are orphaned, they are absolutely at the mercy of that society. They have almost no resources, right? So that's why the Torah is speaking about them, not to limit it to widows and orphans and say, well, it's okay to abuse other people, right? It isn't saying that. It's just saying Torah is speaking about experience, what our experience is. Lefi shehem tishu, I think it's tisuse koach, because they don't have a lot of power. V'davar matzui le'anotam. And he's saying, Rashi goes on to say, very common to take advantage, to oppress these people, taking advantage of people who are not in a good position. Human nature. Im ane ta'ane oto. And it goes on to say, if in fact you do oppress this person, ki im tsa'okit sakalai, and if he cries out to me, Shamua Eshma Tzakato. I will certainly hear his cries. Interesting, right? Ane ta'ane, tza'ok titzak, Shamua Eshma. Notice the doubling up there, right? Let's see what it's saying. Im ane ta'ane, oto, right? If in fact you do oppress this person, hare zimikra katzar. He's saying this is actually sort of it's an abbreviated passage. It's cut off. It doesn't say everything that it might need to say. But let's see, in what sense is it cut off? Gazam. It cuts it off. The scriptures cuts off all the implications it says. Velo piresh onsho. So it doesn't tell you what punishment a person who oppresses the poor or widow or an orphan, etc., people who are socially disadvantaged, doesn't tell you what the punishment is. V'hadichtiv v'hayu neshechem, etc. And the next verse is going to go on to say, and your women, your wives, will become widows and orphans, and your children orphans, right? The fact that it says it, Zehu imtsa'ak yitzok, that is if this person cries out, in other words, this person is so oppressed that they cry out, then in fact, that punishment may well take place. Aval be'im lo yitzak, right? What about if he doesn't cry out? Lo piresh. So it doesn't tell you. And I think it says this kuf lamed right, could mean kasher lahavin. This is a difficulty, right? It's not clear, not clear. I believe. Now, the irony is that that very same abbreviation could mean vikal lahavin, which could mean, and it's a very straightforward. You see that what Rashi just told us is clear. It's clear. And I cannot tell you right now myself what that abbreviation really stands for, whether it's talking about Rashi's explanation or whether it's talking about the concept. That's a complicated concept. So, but he goes on to say, he gives other examples where it doesn't tell you specifically what was going on. So he says in Genesis chapter 4, it talks about the punishment of Cain, and it just goes in there. The verse says, Lachain, and for this reason, kol horeg Cain. It just says anyone who kills Cain. And it says gazam. It doesn't, the Torah cut off the verse. Didn't say. V'lo piresh onshor. It doesn't say what punishment that person is going to receive for killing Cain. Afkan im ano ta'aneh oto. If in fact you do oppress this person, lashon gazum. It's not clear. The language is abbreviated, right? Klomar. It's saying to you, sofcha litot el shacha. It's simply saying you'll get what you deserve. Right? You're going to get what you deserve. Lama, why? Ki im tza'ok yitzak elai. Because if in fact he cries out to me. So again, not terribly clear, but saying this is something there are consequences for this without telling you specifically what the consequences are. It only tells you the consequences if he does call out, he does cry out. So what's the consequence? V'chara api, my anger will blaze. V'haragti etchem b'cherev, I will kill you with the sword. V'hayu neshechem almanot, so that your wives are widows. Uvnechem, and your children, yatomim, will be orphans. Right? Justice. You oppress to a point where they have to cry out, you're going to get the same treatment. You'll be treated the same way. Divine justice. So it's so interesting though, right? I think the reason it is so descriptive is because the abuse of people who are socially disadvantaged is so inherent in society. And that's why the Torah speaks in these kinds of very, very, emphatic terms. So here we have, since it goes on to say, I will kill you, right? Can't we infer, right? You're dead. Can't I automatically figure out that your wives will be widows? If I'm killing you, your wives are going to be widows. And your children are going to be orphans. It says, I'm going to kill you. Ella, however, it's actually referring, this statement about your wives will be widows and your children orphan is actually another curse. It's a different additional consequence. What's the additional consequence? Sheyu hanashim tzrurot ka'almanot. That literally what this is saying is that your wives, the women, will be bound up ka'almanot chayot, like living widows, meaning, let's see if he tells us exactly, shelo yu edim lemitat ba'alehem, because if there are no witnesses to testify that their husbands have been killed, v'tiyena asurot linaseh, they will be forbidden to marry. Remember, one of the commandments is the prohibition against adultery. And if a woman is married, adultery is a married woman having relations with another man. So if a woman cannot prove, if no one can prove that this woman is a widow, meaning she is no longer married because her husband's dead, she is not in a position to, in fact, remarry. And that's another level of things. And that's what Rashi is saying, how the tradition understands the full value of the words here. So they won't be able to remarry because there's no one to testify that their husband was killed, right? Uvahabanim, and the children, Yu Yitomim, they will be orphans, Shelo Yanichum Beitin Lered Lenichse Avehim, because the court which administers the possessions, right, the inheritance of the children, right, will not allow the children to take over the inheritance of the property of their fathers, right? So not allowed, lefi she'en yodim, because the court cannot determine im metu im nashvu, cannot determine whether these men, whether the father was killed, died, or whether he was captured. So the orphans, the children left, cannot take over the property of their father, will never become theirs as a possession because of that, because you cannot determine what actually happened to the father. So I'm gonna stop here because we go on to a new idea, which is, I'll tell you, has to do with charging interest. And that's another interesting issue. So I'm going to stop the share here and give you an opportunity to comment if you wish. So any thoughts about what we're doing? David, you're not muted, so maybe you want to say something?
Rabbi,
Yes.
a few lessons ago, we talked about Jews not benefiting from other Jews. And now we're talking about Jews oppressing people. What's the difference between oppression and benefit?
So when you say benefit, what is your recollection of the context of that?
I think it has to do with, I was talking with Morris about this. I think it has to do with economic benefits.
Usury.
Usury.
Oh, well, we're going to go into usury in this particular case. The next mitzvah is going to be that. Okay. So again, the whole issue of whether or not you should charge interest for of any kind, by the way, it isn't always just financial interest. It can also be that giving someone a gift for the fact that they lent you something can also be understood as, I'm not sure if sometimes it's understood, as something like the seeds of interest or something like that. Okay, or shades of, or the dust of I think avak is the word that's used, the dust of interest. I mean, really not doing that and trying to create a society in which we can benefit each other. So, David, I don't know that I can answer your question here. I know that it's true that regarding fellow Jews, one is not supposed to take advantage. I think it's trying to shore up the idea that we are related to one another. I tend to want to see things in more of a universal kind of way. I don't know if you were here when I shared with you an insight that I thought I had, that when the northern kingdom of Israel was attacked by Assyria, and all those Israelites, those from the 10 northern tribes, were assimilated into the Assyrian kingdom. Essentially, it means that the world's population has Jewish blood in it. That in a way, there's a secret, that's the secret of that particular occurrence, that as awful as it actually was God wanting us to realize that we are all one family, blood-wise as well, not just conceptual-wise. So this is not answering your question. I'm aware of that, right? And I'm not really sure I can answer your question.
Well, let me maybe I explained it wrong. I don't see in a previous lesson we talked about Jew with Jew, and now we're talking about Jew with anybody.
Yes.
So why? And it says oppression. We're not to oppress anyone,
Right.
meaning a Jew against a Jew or a Jew against Goyim.
Yes.
The rest
Yeah.
of the world.
Okay. No, it's okay. Right.
So far, so good. Am I
Yeah,
correct?
yeah. Right.
So
I think
why?
I can answer
Why?
this.
Well, my question is why initially
Yes.
talk about Jew against Jew, and now why don't you say the whole world from right from the
Okay.
beginning?
I think I can answer this.
All right, go ahead.
I think the answer is you go from the simple to the complex. In other words, if you want people to appreciate and understand something, you start with something that they can hang on to easily. And then you move from there to say, but it shouldn't just stop there. Just like, I mean, maybe I could say by parallel, where the Torah mentioned the widow and the orphan, it was only talking about widows and orphans because it's very easy for us to see how widows and orphans would be abused. Likewise, in the case of abusing a Jew, right, we can understand more easily why one shouldn't abuse someone who's part of your own culture and your own religion. And then when you understand that that's wrong, to understand it's wrong, period. You just don't do that. And I mean, in some ways, I feel, the word Torah actually could be translated as teaching or instruction, right? Divine teaching, divine instruction. Lanny isn't here today, but one of the things I learned from Lanny is he said, what's the object of life? And he said, to learn. This I learned from Lanny. Lanny expressed it that way. And I thought how true that is. By the way, there's a German version of that that basically says to learn and to suffer. Interestingly. That's harder to understand, but to learn, you understand. That's why we're here. We're here to gain wisdom. There's a wonderful statement that says, if you gain wisdom, what do you lack? And if you lack wisdom, what have you gained? I think that's in Proverbs. What about the suffering part? Well, I'm sorry to say it, but when people don't suffer, they start finding other things to do that are obnoxious. But when they're having to suffer, then they focus on things that have to do with real survival. You look at what happens to cultures that are too prosperous. Human beings are interesting. We're an interesting group. So I think I've
All
gone away from your initial question, but
right.
hopefully
I'm
not
I'm
too far.
I'm going to have to go, so
It's okay. I'll
I'll talk
stop the
to you
recording.
tomorrow.
No
I,
problem.
I, I
Yeah,
have real quickly.
sure, Morris.
I'm a little confused about you're saying that the widow and the orphans, uh, the woman cannot remarry because there's no evidence that the husband was killed.
Yes.
But why is there no evidence if God strikes him dead?
That's it's a situation of war. It's just talking about reality where there's people that the husbands went off to war and we don't know whether they were captured or killed.
Oh, okay. It's in war. Okay.
That's generally the situation that we're talking about. By the way, there was a practice that before the men went off to war, this actually happened. I had a teacher in South Africa, my Hebrew teacher, professor in South Africa, who lived during the time of World War II, said that in the Orthodox community, the men were given provisional divorces,
That's what the
meaning that if
argument
they
is
didn't,
about
yeah,
Barak and David.
say this again, I'm sorry.
That's the argument of why people say it was okay for David to marry Bathsheba because Barak, when the general, I think it was Barak, maybe it's a
Yeah.
different, went off to war, and so she got she she had a divorce from him.
Oh,
You not heard that before?
I think the story is a little bit different. I think it's Uriah was Bathsheba's husband.
Oh, Uriah. Okay,
Yeah, it's okay.
Uriah.
It's
Yeah.
okay. But the truth was that Barak reported to David that Uriah was killed. David, it's a terrible story, and David's life is not the same. After that incident, his life is different. He has nothing but troubles,
Right.
okay, from that point on in the story. And he conspires with Barak, okay, to 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 make sure that Uriah is close to the siege so that he'll be killed by
Oh, okay.
by the ones who are being besieged. And basically, Barak does that. He follows the orders of his king. And yeah, so it's a terrible indictment of David. And of course, the prophet Nathan comes and talks to David about that. Terrible. Yeah. It's the story, though, it's a marvelous story with full of ironies because Solomon, of course, who's the son of Bathsheba, turns out to be the next king. And he is, for the most part, an amazing king. So,
For the most part, with 1,000 wives.
yeah,
But
well, that's where he went
nobody's
wrong.
perfect.
Go
Nobody's
ahead.
perfect.
Well, I think that's part of the story of the Bible, okay, is to recognize the fact that no human being is perfect by any means, not even close.
Okay, thank you.
But
I
I
got
have to share with you, Morris, one of my favorite sayings, which there are only two perfect people, and that's you and me. And I'm not sure about you. Okay.
I love
Take
it.
care, everyone.
Thanks. All
Be
right.
well. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.